Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. Once again, I am your host, Bjorn Bjorholm, and I want to thank you for joining me on this episode. So for this particular podcast, I thought what we would do would be to do sort of an AMA or an Ask Me Anything type podcast. Now, in the past few episodes, I've mentioned that if you wanted to send me your questions, you could do so to podcast@bjornbjorholm.com, and we would do a mailbag in each episode where I would answer 2 or 3 or 4 questions from people around the world. But in asking you guys to send me questions and comments, I was inundated with emails, and a lot of those emails had really good questions in them. So I thought what we would do is take a lot of those questions and sort of jam them into one episode and turn this into an Ask Me Anything or an AMA type podcast. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So the first question comes from Jason from Michigan, and he says, in the U.S., I think because of the Karate Kid, bonsai has always had this mystique about it. It's that mystique that originally pulled me into the hobby. Having worked so extensively in Japan, do you feel that same mystique exists over there, or is it more of just a hobby for older men? So I think Mayoka-san, in one of the previous episodes where I interviewed Mayoka-san in Japan, he actually mentioned that bonsai is really viewed as an old man's hobby in Japan, and that really is largely true. If you were to go out into the general public in Japan and ask any young person, I'm talking, elementary school age up to, mid-40s or so, almost everybody is going to tell you that bonsai is an old man's hobby. Young people don't practice it. It's kind of boring. There's nothing really that interesting about it. So you don't really see a lot of young people in Japan that interested in bonsai. Now, I think that it's had that sort of vibe to it throughout its entirety in Japan. However, there were periods in Japanese history and really recent Japanese history where there was sort of a cool aspect to bonsai. And this was mostly during the 1980s when the economic bubble was happening in Japan. The economy was growing by leaps and bounds. And a lot of younger people saw an economic opportunity or an economic future in bonsai. So you would see a lot more young people, people coming right out of high school, going straight into apprenticeships during the 1980s into the first part of the 1990s until the bubble burst. And then at that point, there were a lot less young people and a lot less parents pushing their children to go into bonsai. So ever since then, bonsai has really been viewed kind of as an old man's hobby, not really that cool, not really economically viable in terms of a career choice for younger people. So you do get this general vibe in Japan that it is an old man's hobby. However, these days, with the sort of advent of social media and the use of social media around the world, you're starting to see the popularity of bonsai, of course, grow in different areas of the world. And because young Japanese people are also tied into those social networks, they're seeing this as well. They're seeing the popularity of bonsai increase around the world. And there are several people who are starting to pick up on the idea that, maybe if I do go into bonsai, there is an economic opportunity in it outside of Japan. So in other words, they see, maybe people like me or people like, Mauro Stemberger from Italy or Mark Nolanders from Belgium. They see guys like us traveling around the world, teaching, getting to see new places, meeting new people around the world, getting to try new food. And they see sort of like this exciting kind of, lifestyle, the bonsai lifestyle. And they think, okay, maybe there's an opportunity in this economically, or at the very least, there's opportunity to get outside of Japan, see the world, and potentially get to do something that they love to do. So that's coming at it from sort of a different perspective. So in other words, they're coming at it from the perspective of, okay, I can make money at this, I can do this as a job, and then over time they kind of fall in love with bonsai itself as an art. So they're coming at it from a different side of it, whereas, for myself, and I think for most people overseas, in the West, and other parts of the world who are introduced to bonsai, they are introduced to it through the Karate Kid. They feel some sort of mystique about it, like it's this ancient Asian art or Japanese art. So I really want to try my hand at it from the artist or artistic side of the spectrum there. And then for those of us who end up moving into the business realm of it, that's sort of a secondary later decision. So I think right now you're seeing from a different perspective where younger Japanese are getting into bonsai. It's more for potentially an economic opportunity and traveling overseas and less about the mystique of it as an art. So there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. It's just the way that the market is now set up in Japan. It's a saturated market. It's really, really hard to start a new nursery in Japan. And that's one reason why I really think that Maoka-san he's got some giant cojones on him for taking that step and leaving Koka-en and starting his own nursery, starting his own venture, because it is really hard to start a brand new nursery and be successful in Japan, just because there are so many nurseries that have so much history, and to compete with that is very difficult. But again, just as Maoka-san said in that previous episode, he's fully aware that that's the case, and his focus is more on that international market, on bringing people from overseas who want to learn about bonsai, who are really attracted by that mystique, by the love of the art, bring them to his nursery to study so that he can transmit that knowledge. And of course, he'll be traveling overseas. So, when I look at someone like Maoka-san, who, he's still a young guy, he's got a lot of future ahead of him in the bonsai industry. I think he's being very innovative in how he's approaching bonsai, but it's from he really joined into bonsai from that mystique perspective. He loved bonsai to start with, and then the business sort of came secondarily. So he falls kind of outside of what you are starting to see a little bit more of in Japan, which again is coming from the business perspective first, and then falling in love with the art. So I'll give you another example that's kind of from the opposite side. So Fujikawa-san, my teacher, my oyakata, when he was younger, his father started the nursery before Fujikawa-san was born, and then as Fujikawa-san was growing up, he was exposed to bonsai, exposed to that particular industry, and when he went off to university, he decided that he didn't want really to have anything to do with bonsai. He wasn't really that interested in bonsai at that particular age. However, once he finished university, he thought, okay, I'm going to maybe try my hand at becoming a salaryman. It's just, your typical kind of salesman in Japan working for a regular company. He wanted to try his hand at that. So he started looking for a job his last year of university. And then through that process, it's actually called Shushoku Katsudo, which is basically, it translates sort of to job hunting. But essentially what it means is that whole last year of university, you're not really going to classes, you're going out and actually job hunting to find that job. And when you get hired by a company in Japan, you get hired for life. So it's really, really kind of, it's a little strange, it's a little different. But what happens is that whole last year of university, you search for a job, you go to these things called setsumeikai, which are sort of like job fairs, and there could be 10,000 people at a single setsumeikai, and there might be 150 or 300 or 500 companies there. But you take your resume and you go from company to company, you pass it out, and of course you'll do some research before you go. But you take your resume to the companies that you're interested in, you'll pass it out to them, and then you'll get sucked into the interview process with those different companies. And of course, it's just like anywhere in the world, you're competing with other people for the same position. But through that process, you might have 2, 3, 4, 5 interviews. And then if you get chosen by a company, everybody in Japan, doesn't matter what company you're working for, everybody who gets hired that last year of university, they start the very first Monday of April of that year. So, you typically graduate in late January, early February. You have the month of February and March off, and then you'll know by that point where you're going to be working. So the very first Monday in April, everybody in Japan, at all the companies across the country, start on the same date. It's really bizarre, really strange, but that's just the way it's set up. And then, of course, you'll do a couple months of training, and then if you make it through the training, then you become an actual employee, and by that point, you're hired for life. So Fujikawa-san saw this and thought, okay, I can get a job, a full-time job, and have a job for life. There's opportunities. I can sort of expand out beyond my little community here in Osaka and maybe travel overseas, be an international salesman, yada, yada, yada. It's kind of a typical story. What ends up happening for the most part is you get hired as a salesman, you end up going into a company, and you're just kind of like a cog in the wheel, in the sort of functioning of the business, and you really don't have much opportunity to move up without staying long-term in that company. So, and if you switch companies, you will have a very hard time finding another job at another company somewhere else, because the people at that second company will view you as, maybe there's something wrong with this person. They had this lifetime employment opportunity and they screwed it up. So, they look at you maybe as kind of like a quitter. So it's very hard to find another job in another company in Japan once you've been hired directly out of university. So it's a very strange system. But anyway, Fujikawa-san saw this as an opportunity. Thought, okay, I'm gonna try my hand at that. But during that last year of university, when he was doing the Setsumekai and the Shusho Katsudo and traveling around trying to look for a job, he realized, this probably isn't going to be the best opportunity for me. It's not sounding as good as I thought it sounded in my head when I was going through the university process. So the last little bit of his last year at university, he really started to think, okay, maybe I'd like to do bonsai. And actually that last year at university, on the weekends, he started to help his father at the nursery to make a little bit of extra money as kind of like a part-time job. So through that process, he decided, okay, maybe bonsai is kind of interesting. I like being around the trees. I like being exposed to the trees. And of course, this is my father's business. So if I work here, I'll inherit the business. And it's already sort of set up and established. And it just seems much more interesting than sitting in an office, punching numbers into a computer. So right as he graduated from university, he asked his father if he could do an apprenticeship. So his father thought, okay, this is great. I'm going to be able to pass a nursery along to my son, but we got to get him set up with a really good apprenticeship at a really good nursery in Japan. So, of course, at that particular time, this would have been probably 1985, 84, 85, somewhere right around there. The top nursery in all of Japan was Eisei-en, which is Saburo Kato's nursery. So Fujikawa-san's father went up to Saburo Kato's nursery and requested that Mr. Kato take his son on as an apprentice. And Mr. Kato's response was, absolutely not. Your son is too old. So again, at this particular time, there were so many young people who were going into apprenticeships because they or their parents saw an economic opportunity in bonsai, that it was really hard to get an apprenticeship. And Mr. Kato's response was no, because he thought that Fujikawa-san, my teacher, was too old at that point, because most of the apprentices that were coming into his nursery were coming in right after high school. So, 17 and a half, 18, somewhere around there in age. And then Fujikawa-san, when he was going to start his apprenticeship, or when his father requested for his apprenticeship, was already 21, 22, somewhere right around there. So when you go into a hierarchical structure in an organization in Japan, whether that be in a company or in a nursery, I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, but it doesn't matter your age. What matters is how long you've been in that company, and that sort of dictates your position. And it's not really a merit-based system either. It's, you could be first-year employee pulling in sales like crazy, 10 times the amount as someone who's been there for 3 or 4 years, but you'll still be bottom on the totem pole, and that other person who may not be nearly as productive as you will be much higher up on the totem pole. So there's this weird disconnect. A lot of that has to do with the lifetime employment and all of that. There's a cultural element there too. But that was the response of Mr. Kato. He thought that with Fujikawa-san, my teacher, already being 22 or 23, coming in, he would have senpai, or people who were higher than him in the hierarchy, who were 2 or 3, maybe 4 years younger than he was. And he felt that, there might be like a contentious sort of relationship there between Fujikawa-san and his senpai who were younger because of that age difference. So he said flat out no. But of course, Fujikawa-san's father, he really wanted him to study there. He knew that he would have the best opportunity in Japan to take the nursery forward if he studied at Mr. Kato's nursery. So he kept asking and kept asking and kept asking. And finally, Mr. Kato took him on as an apprentice. So he became an apprentice at about the age of 22 or 23 and did a 5.5-year apprenticeship, gave an extra 6 months as a gift. So by the time he graduated, he was basically, about 28, 29, somewhere right around there, which is, quite late in comparison to his senpai or most other people who were going into apprenticeships at that particular time. But there was this mystique about bonsai. Like Fujikawa-san's father, he loved plants, he loved bonsai. And then from the opposite end of the spectrum, he saw an economic opportunity for his son. His son saw an economic opportunity in bonsai, so he sort of got pushed into it from that, or decided to go into it from that perspective, and eventually fell in love with bonsai. So, it really depends on the situation. It depends on who it is, the situation in history. At that particular time in the 80s with the economy, everything just sort of worked its way out. And that's how Fujikawa-san, my teacher, got involved in bonsai as a profession. So, there is that mystique, I think, that underlies it for a lot of people in Japan. But overall, as part of the general population in Japan, it's viewed really as an old man's hobby. So the second question on this podcast comes from Pedro. And Pedro says, on the second episode of the podcast, you mentioned the preferences of the Japanese for bonsai with no scars on the trunks and how that favors growing bonsai from seed in grow boxes or other small medium. The forums and people I follow as a source of knowledge on bonsai almost unanimously say that bonsai is more about reducing than it is about growing, and mostly recommend, as you pointed out, to let the tree grow in the ground for maximizing the thickness of the trunk and then chopping it to reduce the height of the tree. I haven't seen much information on growing techniques, so can you further develop this in a future podcast or share any source I can use? Say I have a seedling or sapling growing in a grow bag or a box. Should I just let it grow to its full height capacity for the medium it's in? Is the trunk only going to get thicker with time as I trim the branches? So this is another fantastic question. So I did mention in a previous podcast kind of the general aesthetic preference for certain types of deciduous trees to have no scars on the trunk and no deadwood on the trunk. So, for example, Japanese maples, Stewardia, anything really with a smooth bark to it. You'll very rarely see trees with massive scars in Japan, and almost never see trees like that have naturally smooth bark with deadwood features on the trunk done on purpose. So, and again, this has a lot to do with, sort of the long-term development of the trees, the cultural elements in Japan that favor long-term development. And of course, developing a tree like that with no scars on the trunk, it takes a heck of a lot more work than it does to plant the tree in the ground, let it thicken up, and then trunk chop it with scars on the trunk. So now I want to be very clear here. I've had a little bit of confusion from people from all sides, lots of different questions from folks about this particular subject. So when I say that the Japanese prefer to have scarless trunks on some of those deciduous trees, again, like Japanese maples, beech, Stewardia, certain hornbeams, what I meant by that was, obviously you want to have nice, smooth movement to the tree, nice, wonderful taper to the tree, but you don't want, big, fat, ugly scars on the trunk. But that doesn't mean that big branches haven't been removed strategically in certain parts of the trunk to create a little bit of thickening in certain places. It's just that they're grown a little bit more slowly in a little bit different process, being grown in wooden boxes almost exclusively or in containers exclusively during the course of their lifetime. So that provides you much more control over how fast the growth or the trunk thickens, and then also how fast each of those individual branches thicken that are used as sacrifice branches and that are then cut off and healed over. So when I say that there's no major scars on the trunks of these trees, that doesn't mean that there haven't been branches that have been removed and those wounds have been completely healed over. But it's done in a certain way where we're focusing on long-term development and avoiding growing the trunks so fast that you have to make trunk chops on them where the actual angle of the trunk is made by cutting it on a certain sharp, deep angle, and that wound never really heals over time because the wound is so large. So when we're working with deciduous trees, let's just take Japanese maples, for example. One of the most common ways that Japanese maple bonsai are developed is you'll start with a plant that has a naturally small leaf size. So, maybe you find a tree out in nature, so in the Japanese mountains, or maybe there's a tree that's growing in a local nursery that has a naturally small leaf size that you want to utilize as a bonsai. Well, you would take that material and you would air layer a certain branch off of that material. Now, the air layering process is a little difficult to explain in a podcast, but essentially the way it works is you find a branch on a tree, you pick a strategic point on that branch, or even on the trunk of a tree. It might be at the apex of the tree, it might be at the end of a branch, it might be at the beginning of a branch, but you find a strategic place on the branch or the trunk where you want to air layer. And by strategic place, I mean the point where you air layer out to the end of that branch or the end of the apex, or whatever you're air layering off, should have a certain type of movement to it. There should be some taper to it. So again, you're strategically choosing a portion of a branch to air layer off. You'll cut a strip of bark off around the branch or the apex or the trunk, whatever you're going to air layer. You'll put sphagnum moss around that. Then you'll cover that with plastic and keep it moist. And over the course of a growing season, that'll produce roots within that sphagnum moss. And once you produced enough roots the following spring, you can cut that off and you'll have a totally separate plant with its own root structure. Now, by doing this air layering process, what you're doing is expediting the development of a very fat, wide base with a radial nabari or surface root structure. So this gives you sort of a baseline, basic start for a tree that's going to eventually have a nice nabari and nice taper right from the base of the plant. Now, you take that air layer and you plant it in a container. Typically, a wooden box is quite commonly used in Japan for developing deciduous material like this because the wood allows a lot more oxygen penetration to reach the root system, which is beneficial to the health and the growth of the plant. So when we plant these trees in a wooden box, the wooden box is typically quite shallow, the goal being to allow the roots to spread outward from the trunk rather than down. Now, what this does is it creates a nice spreading wide nabari that over time, if you strategically place the roots each time you repot and strategically scrape the roots each time you repot, that will also expedite the process of the thickening and widening of the base of the tree, or at the very least, the widening of the nabari. And then over time, the trunk will start to thicken little by little. Now, you can expedite the thickening of the trunk in that container by strategically allowing certain branches or the apex of the tree to grow unencumbered for at least a portion of the growing season. So, for example, if we wanted to thicken the trunk, the base of the tree on a Japanese maple, we would let one point on the apex completely grow. We'd let it just elongate without pinching it back at all. But we'd pinch all of the rest of the tree or all of the rest of the shoots in the spring back to the first pair of leaves like we do on all Japanese maples. Again, if you wanted to thicken the branches, you would let one strategic tip on each of those branches elongate while pinching back the remaining tips on that same branch. This is going to thicken the main portion of the branch while ramifying that branch at the same time. So again, you're expediting the ramification process, you're expediting the thickening process of certain strategic branches or branches that you've strategically chosen to thicken, and you're also expediting the thickening of the trunk by allowing that apical point to elongate. That's going to pull a lot of energy up from the roots up into the top of the tree, and over time, a very short amount of time, that trunk will start to thicken. But you have to set up each of these stages in the right steps or the right process to get to that final end goal, which is going to be a wide nabari, nice taper, nice movement to the tree, thick branches at the bottom of the tree, getting progressively thinner as you get towards the top, and of course, a scarless trunk. Now again, some of those branches that you're allowing to elongate, you may be allowing those to elongate to a point where they get so thick that they have to get cut off, but you've done that in a strategic way because that's thickened a certain portion of the trunk below that branch, right? So if you want to thicken the trunk at the bottom of the tree, for example, some of the lower branches you can allow to elongate, get very thick, and potentially cut those off because whatever is growing below those branches in terms of the trunk is going to thicken because you've allowed those branches to elongate. Same thing with the apex. If you're allowing the apex to grow upright, you're going to eventually have to cut it back. But you don't want to let it grow so big like you would potentially in the ground where you have to cut it so far back that you end up with this weird angled chop. What you want to do is strategically let that branch grow out to a certain point. This could be 2 feet, it could be 3 feet, it could be 4 feet, but you're keeping that growth controlled while ramifying the rest of the branches around it by pinching back to the first set of leaves. And then at that strategic point, which may be at the end of that first growing season, or maybe you wait till the second growing season, but you're going to cut that branch back down to the base. And then the wound that's created from that will then be able to heal over if it's done properly. So it's the same process with the apex. You're allowing that branch to grow upright, so that single point at the top of the tree to grow upright as high as possible, and then you're going to eventually cut that back. That may be at the end of one growing season, it might be at the end of 2 growing seasons, but you're going to pick a strategic time to cut that branch back where you're allowing the trunk to taper. You're not allowing that top to get so thick that when you cut that branch back, you have a massive scar. You will have a scar, but because it's not too big, and I'm saying, typically with, say, a Japanese maple, for example, we're working with Japanese maples here. With Japanese maple, if the wound is less than about 3 inches or so in diameter, that'll heal over pretty quickly, particularly if you have it in a good soil medium and you're watering it properly, fertilizing it properly. That wound will heal over in a reasonable amount of time. And then given a little bit more time, as the bark starts to whiten up and age, the wound itself will start to blend in with the rest of the bark, and you'll be left with just this little sort of, puckered mouth look to that wound, but it's so minimal that you're really not going to notice it. So again, when I said no scars on the trunk, I didn't mean that we don't cut branches or the apex off strategically to get the right taper, to get the right movement. What I mean is you pick a strategic time to cut that off so the wound isn't so large that it's not going to heal over, and we give it time for the bark to kind of meld together, mesh together in terms of its color and texture with the rest of the trunk. So I think there was a little bit of confusion about that. It's not that there's zero scars necessarily. It's that they're so minuscule and they're done in such a way that they're almost imperceptible in the long run. All right, so question number 3 on this Ask Me Anything podcast comes from another Pedro. This is Pedro Fernandez from Spain. Pedro is actually one of my students at our school at Bonsai Sense in Mallorca. So I travel to Mallorca, which is an island off of Spain, twice a year to work at Bonsai Sense, which is a great nursery there. We have a school where we have intensive students come in once in the spring and once in the fall. So Pedro is one of the students at that intensive school. So Pedro's question is, my only question or request is if you can talk a bit about the different kinds of bonsai nurseries that exist in Japan and the Yamadori culture, or the culture around collected material. So in Japan, I think I might have mentioned this in a previous podcast, but in Japan, the nurseries are sort of set up in a very specified way. So in other words, certain nurseries will focus on very specific aspects of bonsai. So there are nurseries that exclusively grow plants in the ground, in the field. So a lot of nurseries, for example, in Takamatsu will grow Japanese white pines, for example, or Japanese black pines in the ground for trunk thickening purposes. Now, before I get a bunch of emails saying, oh, you said you're not supposed to grow trees in the ground, it depends on the species of tree, okay? It depends on the goal with that tree. So we'll get into this in a future podcast episode about sort of those differences. But in any case, there are nurseries that focus exclusively on growing plants in the ground, like black pines and white pines. You know, if you go down to Takamatsu, for example, which is a city on the island of Shikoku, they have a couple of very famous bonsai villages there. One's called Kinashi and the other is Kokobunji. But there are nurseries down there that are just fields full of beautiful Japanese black and white pines that have been grown in the ground for 30, 50, 80, 100 years. I think that those two villages have somewhere around 300 years of history as being plant production and bonsai production areas. So there's a lot of history there. But in any case, you have nurseries that grow plants in the ground like that. You've got other nurseries that grow deciduous material exclusively in containers, say in wooden boxes. They're doing the air layering, you know, the first sort of steps in that process of air layering branches off of larger trees or garden stock. So you get that first sort of level of production. And then you have this sort of secondary stage nurseries where they take that material and then take it to the next step, whether that be grafting more roots onto the base of the tree or grafting branches onto the tree. And within the grafting community or the grafting nurseries, you'll have very specified nurseries as well, meaning that some nurseries will do exclusively flowering apricot grafting, or some nurseries will do exclusively Japanese black pine or juniper grafting. So they're highly specialized nurseries. And then from there, you have sort of the next step in the process. There's sort of a layer of nurseries that focus on sort of that initial styling of that material, meaning applying the wire, you know, bending the branches down, setting the bone structure. And then you'll have the next step, which is the more sort of detailed developmental nurseries, you know, the ramification process, all of that. And then you have nurseries like Fujikawa-san's nursery, where I studied, where we focused almost exclusively on high-end material. So we worked with every species, every size, but we were focused exclusively on working with material at a really high quality level. You know, if you go to, for example, Mr. Kimura's nursery up in Tokyo, Masahiko Kimura, he is exclusively a conifer nursery, but within that, he does grafting and he does heavy bends, he does bone structure setting and high refinement. So the specialization there is all conifers, but in terms of technique, he works with the whole range. Whereas at Fujikawa-san's nursery, we worked exclusively on high quality material, but we worked with the whole range in terms of size and in terms of species. So it really just depends on sort of what your focus is and what your specialty is. But I think with that kind of market setup in Japan, what it's allowed is for, you know, with this sort of specialization, it's allowed for each of these individual nurseries to become the best at what they do in the world, right? So, you know, in the States with setting up our nursery here in Nashville, what I have to do is basically be a Renaissance man. I had to be good at, or try to be as good as I can be at every aspect of bonsai. So I do grafting. I graft flowering apricots. I graft Japanese maples. I graft roots on Stewardia. I graft branches on junipers, and then I do major bends on Yamadori, that initial bone setting design of Yamadori material. And I do high refinement stuff as well, preparing trees for exhibition. So here it's not specialized like that. So you really sort of have to have, the whole range of understanding of each of these elements to be able to operate the nursery, because there's so many questions, these great questions that you guys are sending in for the podcast. They're coming from all different angles, all different perspectives. Everybody wants to know the right answer. Now, of course, with that, I don't know everything about everything. So if there's a question that comes in that I'm not sure what the answer is, I will defer to another expert or recommend another expert to you guys so that you can get that proper answer. So anytime you guys send me a question and I don't address it on the podcast, I will try to send you a resource that you can talk to directly to get the proper answer. So the second half of Pedro's question was about Yamadori culture in Japan. So back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when bonsai was really taking off, particularly in the 80s, there was this huge push for collecting Yamadori. And again, this had a whole lot to do with the economic opportunities that a lot of people saw in collecting that material and then selling it. And in particular, Itoigawa Shinpaku juniper from the Niigata prefecture in Japan were super popular. They were the most sought-after Yamadori, and there were so many collectors that were going up into the mountains, digging these trees up willy-nilly. If they dig 10 trees up, one survives, they can sell that one tree for a crazy profit, so it doesn't really matter that the other 9 trees died. So because that happened so often in the 70s and 80s, particularly in the 80s, the Japanese government put a stop to collecting Yamadori, particularly the Itoigawa Shinpaku from the Niigata prefecture. And, there are still, of course, some great examples of Yamadori that are still in the mountains, and it's really good that the government put a stop to that, because all of those trees would probably be gone at this point if they didn't do that. But what's interesting is that there are certain other regions in Japan where Yamadori can still be collected, and there are also areas of privately owned land, including the sides of entire mountains that are privately owned, where trees can be collected still today in Japan. So what you see, instead of naturally occurring Itoigawa Shinpaku juniper from Niigata, which are sort of the pinnacle of the bonsai world in Japan, or the most sought after species of Yamadori in Japan, what you see now is people are collecting, for example, Tohoku Shinpaku from the Tohoku region up north, or Hokkaido Shinpaku even further north, and then they're grafting Itoigawa foliage to that material. So there still seems to be kind of this constant supply of new Yamadori material, new junipers in particular, but it's not naturally occurring Itoigawa from Niigata. It's, again, Tohoku Shinpaku or Hokkaido Shinpaku with Itoigawa grafted to it. So there's just, if you know what you're looking at, there's this kind of disconnect between the deadwood and the foliage, because the deadwood of those particular species, Tohoku and Hokkaido, it's much more chunky, much heavier than Itoigawa deadwood. So you don't get the really nice striations, the really sort of elegant look to the deadwood on those that you do with Itoigawa. And then you see that nice fine Itoigawa foliage grafted to that. It just doesn't match just right. Still looks cool. There's a great tree at Iura-san's nursery. Iura-san is a very famous grafter. He grafts Shinpaku almost exclusively up in, I guess he's in Obuse, which is just outside of Nagano. So he's very talented at grafting. I think he's second generation, very, very talented. He has some very famous Shinpaku at his nursery, including one called Fujin. Is the name of the tree. I'm sure you guys have seen it. Just a massive, beautiful tree, crazy deadwood to it. It's actually, I believe it's Tohoku Shinpaku, and it's grafted with Itoigawa foliage, and it's grafted with a very specific type of Itoigawa foliage that the Iura-san family has basically exclusive rights to. They cultivated this Itoigawa foliage. It's a very distinct, very soft Itoigawa foliage, very fine, but it grows incredibly quickly. And they graft that to the Tohoku Shinpaku. So this tree, Fujin, is fabulous, fantastic tree, one of the most powerful trees I've ever seen in person. But if you look at the foliage and you look at the deadwood, there's just this slight disconnect in terms of the coarseness of the deadwood versus the softness of the foliage. But to get back to Pedro's question about sort of Yamadori culture in Japan, Yamadori are still the most sought after. Particularly junipers in Japan. They're still the most sought-after examples of bonsai, but they're a little bit harder to come by because of the laws that have been put in place. That being said, I think that if the Japanese could have access to Yamadori from overseas and bring that into Japan, I think that they'd eat that stuff up. So, for example, our Rocky Mountain junipers in the United States, the deadwood on those trees is actually somewhat similar to Itoigawa deadwood, but the foliage is not great, at least not consistently great. So if they could get a hold of the bones of our Rocky Mountain junipers here in the States, bring those to Japan and graft them with Itoigawa foliage, you would have a lot of trees that look like naturally occurring Itoigawa collected Yamadori, despite the fact that the trunks are American, Rocky Mountain junipers grafted with the native or cultivated Itoigawa in Japan. So there's still a huge drive and a huge desire to have that Yamadori in Japan. It's just they can't get it. So that's why I'm so excited to be back in the States, because we've got, again, as I mentioned with Maoka-san, we've got almost unlimited territory where Yamadori can be collected. So it's very exciting, very, very, whimsical, fantastic, beautiful, gorgeous trees to be collected out of the mountains. But again, as we mentioned in that podcast with Thomas and Maoka-san, there has to be sort of a moral responsibility to not over-collect those trees for purposes of trying to make a profit. So doing this as a living, like I do, I'm fully aware of that. I want to be able to make this an economically viable career opportunity for myself. But at the same time, there has to be a balance in wanting that material to be able to sell it and have it at my nursery, and making sure that material is still preserved in nature. Or if I do get that material, that Yamadori material, that I preserve it to the best of my ability. Because, as I've mentioned in other podcasts, when we take a tree from the mountains, it may be sort of, struggling, it's surviving, but it's not thriving. When we take it out of the mountains, put it in a pot, and try to cultivate it as a bonsai, the goal is to help that tree thrive and really come to its full potential in terms of health. So on the back end, with the material that has been collected and that will be collected in the future, it should be everyone's goal who is obtaining that material and developing it to make sure that survives and make sure that it thrives, more importantly. So that's my goal going forward, and I think that that's reflected in Japan to a large degree, despite the fact that they can't get a hold of that material anymore. Okay, so the next question comes from David, and David asks, what are your thoughts on tanuki? Do you consider them true bonsai or a cheat substitute? So let's define terms here. Tanuki is essentially where you take a piece of dead wood that's completely dead, nothing alive on it at all, and then you take a whip of a live plant. So say for example a Shinpaku juniper could be 12, 15, 18 inches, 45 centimeters long. With some foliage on it, and you take that dead wood, you carve a groove into the dead wood, you stick that live tree into that groove, you nail it in, and then over time it kind of develops and sort of looks like a naturally occurring, living Yamadori, collected tree. So the word tanuki in Japan, it comes from the name of what's essentially a raccoon dog. It's an animal. They call it a raccoon dog. I don't know if it's related more to raccoons or to dogs, but it looks like a combination of a raccoon and a dog. Like they mated and they made a raccoon dog. It's a ridiculous looking animal. But if you ever go to Japan and you walk around, look at the front doors of businesses, you'll often see a little ceramic version of a tanuki, of one of these raccoon dogs. They're always standing upright. They usually have a little hat on, like a straw hat, and they have, excuse my language here, but they've got giant testicles that hang down to the ground. And this is just a normal thing you see in front of businesses. So those tanuki are supposed to be good luck for the business. But they are also known as being very mischievous or very devious as an animal. So they trick people. There's a lot of Japanese folklore where these tanuki trick certain Japanese people within those stories, and that's just become part of general Japanese folklore. So the reason that in Japan they use that word tanuki to describe taking a dead piece of wood and attaching a live tree to it is because you're essentially trying to trick the audience into thinking that tree was a naturally occurring yamadori that was collected and then turned into a bonsai. So because of that, because it has that connotation of trying to trick the audience, it's viewed in Japan very negatively. So you will never see a tanuki in an exhibition in Japan, at least not one of the major exhibitions. So, for example, the Taikon 10 or the Sakufu 10 or the Kokufu 10, you will not see a tanuki in there. And if you do see a tanuki in there and you can spot one, you must be really, really good at what you do, because those trees have all gone before a panel of judges, particularly at the Sakufu 10 and the Kokufu 10, and any tree that's a potential tanuki will get weeded out. Now, there are some really good examples of tanuki in Japan they're really hard to tell that they're fake, but if you know what you're looking for, you should be able to tell. So, it's considered a cheat. It's considered trying to trick the audience, so it's viewed very negatively. And to me, I don't particularly care for tanuki. I think it's one of those ways to sort of expedite the process of actually finding a 300-year-old yamadori in the mountains, delicately collecting it, and then building it into a bonsai. It's a cheap sort of cheat way of getting around that. So I don't particularly care for it myself. Now, one thing I have seen in Japan that sort of ties into tanuki is you'll see quite often at certain exhibitions on deciduous trees, fruiting trees, you'll see fruit attached to those trees. So, for example, Chinese quince, Pseudocydonia, one of my favorite species to work with. Beautiful trees. They've got the sort of thick, kind of muscly looking, it's not bark, but the trunks are very muscly looking, multicolored bark to them, kind of different shades of gray, maybe a little bit of orange in it. They develop quite quickly if you defoliate them in May and wire them, but they do produce fruit. They produce these big yellow fruits. Now, for an exhibition, the idea is to show the trees at their peak form, and we want to typically have odd numbers of things when we're showing the tree. So, for example, if it's a multi-trunk forest, it's typically an odd number. If we're showing a tree with fruit on it, it's typically with odd numbers of fruit. And with those odd numbers of fruit, they need to be strategically placed within the branches so it still looks balanced. You don't want 3 fruits all on the right side of the tree and the tree's moving to the left. It's going to look unbalanced. It's going to look weird. So quite often what will happen is, if you have a tree with several fruits on it, many of the fruits will get taken off, and maybe perhaps one of the fruits is in the wrong position, so they'll take that fruit off and then move it to a new position on the tree and reattach it. Or if the tree only has 2 fruits on it and you need a 3rd fruit, maybe you go to another tree of the same species, grab a fruit off of it, and then strategically place it on the tree so it has 3 fruits on it for the exhibition. Now, to me, there's still a little bit of cheating in there, but it's not as extreme, in my opinion, as a typical tanuki where you do take the dead wood and the live wood or live trunk and attach them together. So, to me, I could forgive the switching of the fruit more than I could taking the dead wood and the live wood and attaching it. Now, the worst example I've seen of reattaching fruit to a tree in Japan was actually at a major exhibition. It was at the Taikon 10. Now, this is something that oversteps the bounds, in my opinion. There was a persimmon, very large persimmon, beautiful tree. It was a princess persimmon, actually. So the fruits are quite small. The size of a golf ball, a little smaller than a golf ball. So this tree, it was very tall, maybe, probably 70 centimeters or so. So what's that, about 2.5 feet from the top of the pot to the top of the tree. So quite large for princess persimmon. And it was placed in a position, it was very prominent, and you walk up and you could see it from a distance. It was just covered in fruit. It looked beautiful, spectacular. But if you got closer to the tree, what you would notice is that it wasn't the fruits that were attached to the tree from another plant. It was actually the branches with the fruits on them were cut off of another tree and attached to this tree. So if you look really closely, you could see the little dots of glue where they had taken the branches from another tree with the fruit on it, cut those branches off, and then strategically glued it all over this tree. So to me, that was taking it a little bit too far, because it wasn't just 2-3 fruits here and there. It was like 50 fruits on the tree with all of these little branches that were cut off of another plant and stuck onto this plant that was in the show. So that was overstepping the bounds, in my opinion. But again, if it's 1 or 2 fruits here and there just to create a better sense of balance within the tree, I'm cool with that. But to answer the question directly, if it's a traditional tanuki with the dead wood and the live branch attached together, live trunk attached together, that to me is a total cheating and something I do not prefer. Okay, the next question comes from Jason, and this question is about some of our junipers at Kokaen in Japan. So Jason says, one question about something that I've seen on your vlogs a couple of times. It looks like at the nursery, you guys bring the junipers that are going to the kokofu indoors during the winter. Does this deprive them of a dormant period and harm the tree? So with the temperatures in Japan, it really depends on where you are in Japan. Japan's very long latitudinally, so you have basically Arctic temperatures way up in the north, and then you've got essentially tropical temperatures if you go way down to the islands way down south, like Okinawa. So you have a huge range of temperatures. But in the main portion of Japan, so Honshu, the main island of Japan, you've got, of course, Osaka and Kyoto, Nara and Tokyo. All of those cities are on Honshu. That's a pretty temperate climate there, so you'll have temperatures that in the winter are going to hover around freezing, maybe get down to, say 20 degrees or so Fahrenheit, which is probably -3, -4 Celsius, so relatively cold, below freezing, and then of course in the summer it gets quite warm. But to answer your question, the reason that we bring those junipers in during the winter, the trees that are going to the kokofu, is because if we leave those out during the winter and expose them to the cold temperatures below freezing, they're going to get something called shimoyake, or basically frost burn on the foliage, and that's going to turn the foliage a brown or a purple color. So particularly the trees that are going into the kokofu, they have to have a vibrant green color to them to be able to go through the judging process and get put in the show. If they come up with that purpley kind of brownish look to them, even if they're a spectacular tree, even if they're a tree that might win the kokofu, the judges will not allow those trees to go into the exhibition because they look really unhealthy at that point, and it's just because they're that brownish color. That doesn't mean that the tree's been damaged or been hurt at all. It's just a natural color that the junipers, and particularly Itoigawa Shinpaku, and also Hinoki cypress in Japan, and what else? Cryptomeria, they'll turn that really brownish color, and that's completely natural, completely normal. They'll green right back up in the spring, but to get them in the show, they have to be bright, vibrant green. Same thing is true for the trees that we're taking up to the kokofu sales area. The trees that we have on our sales booth, if they're all that kind of brownish or purplish color, just doesn't look very good. They look sick or dying. And I've had lots of people ask me about trees when they come to visit Fujikawa-san's nursery, for example, in the winter. Trees that we're not taking to the kokofu that are outside, they'll say, "Oh, is something wrong with that tree?" No. It's just the fact that they've been exposed to those low temperatures. They've turned that brownish or purplish color, but they'll come back in the spring. That's not a problem. So the trees that we're putting on the sales booth, we treat the same way. We put them inside. Now, when I say inside, what we have at Fujikawa-san's nursery and what we'll build here at Eisei-en, our new nursery in Nashville, is a facility that is basically like an unheated room. It's not a greenhouse. It's just an unheated, simple room, but it's got windows all around it. So the trees still get plenty of light during the course of the winter. Despite the fact that they're dormant, they're still photosynthesizing. So if it's a conifer, it retains its leaves. It does need to have some light exposure in the winter. You might be able to get 1 or 2 winters, maybe 3, 4 winters of keeping it in complete darkness for the duration of the winter without the tree declining. But over time, if you do that year after year after year, the tree will probably decline in health. So we do have windows so that they can get light during that period. But the room is unheated, and the temperatures in Japan stay pretty consistent during the course of the winter. So, at night, there might be periods where it drops quite low, but typically it's going to hover right around freezing, maybe -1, -2 Celsius. So what's that, 28, 29 degrees Fahrenheit, kind of hovers right around that temperature point. So we can keep the trees in there without them getting too cold. It keeps the hard frost on them. And then during the day, the temperatures don't really rise that much, Although we will open the windows because with the sunlight beaming through the windows, it does heat up a little bit. So we can keep those trees dormant during the course of the entire winter season, while at the same time preserving that nice, dark, vibrant green color that makes them easier to get into the kokufu and easier really to sell at the kokufu sales booth. All right, so this next question is from Sean, who's from Maryland, and it kind of ties into the last question that was just asked about what we do with the junipers in the winter. His question is, what do you do with your thyme/trees during winter? So again, it depends on the species, depends on kind of what the goal is with the tree. But for example, the junipers, any tree that's going to turn kind of weirdish color, we put under cover if we're going to be showing it. If we're not going to be showing it, we'll keep it outside. Now, you can get as complicated as you want in terms of how to overwinter trees. You could say, for example, with Japanese maples, if the roots get below 17 degrees Fahrenheit, which I don't know what that is in Celsius, it's quite low, minus, probably 8, 10 degrees, something like that. If you get below that point in Fahrenheit, 17 degrees, it'll actually start to kill the roots. So you can get as scientific as you want with it, but why push things that far? Why do that? What's the point of doing that? There really is no point. We want to make sure that all of the branches survive on our bonsai because we're strategically picking branches to create an overall aesthetic design that we desire. So if a branch dies, you're going to have to change the design of the tree. So why risk that by keeping it outside during the winter down to that lowest possible temperature? So my recommendation is when you get into the winter season, if you're in a temperate climate, and you're going to be getting down quite low, keep everything right at about 33 degrees Fahrenheit, so about 1 degree Celsius, just above freezing. That's going to allow the trees to dry out without, freezing the root systems. You can then continue to water them. They'll still photosynthesize. They'll still grow if they're conifers, just a little bit. But you're not risking killing any of the branches, particularly on deciduous trees at that point as well. So I don't recommend that you keep everything solid, frozen all winter. That's never a good thing. I don't recommend that you try to push it as low as you can possibly go, and then when it's going to hit that 17 degree Fahrenheit temperature, then put the stuff inside. Just keep everything at a sort of consistent right around freezing, just slightly above freezing, and you'll be totally fine. The trees are going to survive. They're going to thrive. You're not going to kill off branches as long as you're watering the trees, making sure you check the water. And that's something you got to be really careful of, especially with conifers, because in the winter they are going to dry out because they're retaining their leaves. So if you're keeping them slightly above freezing, you are going to have to water them on a consistent basis. So I just recommend that you do that because you're not going to risk killing off potentially important sections of foliage or branches or the apex or any portion of the tree. So again, we could get as scientific as we wanted here, but it's not really necessary. We can simplify this particular process and say, just keep everything right at or slightly above freezing if it's a temperate tree and you're in a temperate climate. Now, in terms of what I do with my time in the winter, deep winter is not really the ideal time to do, major heavy bends on trees. Really, this is another simplification here too. If you want to do heavy major bends on the trees, don't do them in the extreme times of the year, meaning don't do them in the extreme deep winter or the extreme heat of the summer. Make sure that you're doing it, in an off season when it's a little bit cooler or, not as warm as the hottest part of the summer. So again, that's just a simplification. We could really get into the details of it, and potentially in future podcasts we will. But what I typically do in the winter, because it's not the best time to do massive heavy bends on trees, I'll do a lot of silhouette refinement with the deciduous trees, do a lot of detail work, detail wiring on the conifers. That's not a problem at all that time of year. If you are maintaining the trees at or slightly above freezing, because it's not extremely cold, you can, if necessary, absolutely necessary, because you're pressed for time, you can do some of those heavy bends, but you have to really be careful and protect the trees after that process. So again, I don't recommend doing that, but in my case, I have very limited time to do a lot of the heavy work on trees, so sometimes I will do that in the deep winter months, but I don't recommend doing that. Again, avoid extreme temperatures on both ends of the spectrum when you're doing a heavy work like that. But for me, because my time is limited, I travel 7 months out of the year. Once we get the nursery set up here, I'll be able to do a lot of this work at the proper time. in other seasons, but for right now, I got to jam stuff in when I can. So for me, it's a little different. But if you're, just a general hobbyist or you're working on your trees, I don't recommend that you do those extreme things in the winter. But for me, I focus a lot on that kind of stuff. I do a lot of refinement work with the deciduous trees, and then refinement work as well with the conifers. So I also go back to Japan in January and February because my wife and we run a Japan bonsai tour. So we actually just finished a tour in Japan. I just flew back to the States a couple days ago. We had 24 people from 8 countries around the world. We took them to all sorts of different nurseries and gardens, from Kyoto to Osaka, Tokyo, out to Omiya. And of course, we went to the Kokufu 10, or the Japanese National Exhibition. So this is something I'll be doing with Nancy every year. And every other year, we'll also have a Gafu 10 tour, which is the Shohin show, which is held every year in January in Kyoto. So we'll have a tour for that as well. We're going to be doing that in 2019. So I'll keep you guys posted on that. But that's how I spend the bulk of my winter now, is trying to jam as much work as I possibly can, because most people around the world kind of put their trees to bed. So that gives me an opportunity to sit down and actually work on the stuff I need to work on, despite the fact that it's not really the ideal time of the year to do that. Okay, so that's going to bring us to the end of this AMA, or Ask Me Anything podcast. I hope you guys like this format. I thought this was, an interesting way to kind of dive into some of the questions that you guys have been sending me and catch up really on a lot of those questions, because we've got so many coming in constantly. So I'm going to try to do a better job in future episodes of the podcast to answer more of those questions little by little, so they don't build up so much in the background. But that being said, keep sending me your questions. These are really great questions. They provide really great content, and I hope you guys like the responses or the answers that I've given. If there's stuff that you still want me to clarify, send in your questions about that, and we will make that happen. Again, you can send those to podcast@bjornbjorholm.com, and I will do my best to answer those in a future episode. The next episode of the podcast, I will be in India. I'm actually flying out tomorrow morning. I'll be going to Pune, India, to work with the ladies of Bonsai Namaste. They're hosting a huge bonsai conference. It's a city that's just outside of Mumbai. It's Pune is the name of the city. But I'll be there for a few days, and I'm going to be with, I think, 18 or 19 other international demonstrators, and of course, a lot of the Indian demonstrators as well, and bonsai professionals. So I'm going to try to do some interviews there, some podcasts there with some of my friends from around the world who are bonsai professionals, and get their perspective on Indian bonsai and on bonsai in their parts of the world as well. So I hope you guys will tune into that. I'm looking forward to that, and we're going to call it good for this podcast. So once again, thank you so much for checking it out.